The Positive Theory of Capital by Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk. Book 6. The Source of Interest. Chapter 3. The Profit of Capitalist Undertaking. Complications. The principle laid down in the last chapter is simple, but in practical life it is, as usual, obscured by a multitude of casuistical details and developments. These do not, indeed, prevent its operation, but they conceal it under various phenomenal forms, such as make recognition of it not always easy. Some of these developments we must take up, and we shall begin with one of the simplest. The contraction of value from which, in our estimation, future goods suffer is, as we know, by no means uniform to all future goods. It is graduated according to the time which intervenes between the present and the date at which the goods are ready for use. £100, for instance, which will be available in a year's time, will be valued at perhaps something like £95 in present money, £100 available in a couple of years at £90, £100 available in 3 years, hence at £85, and so on. To this graduated contraction of value corresponds a steady graduated increase in value of those goods, which are in process of ripening into present goods. A group of instruments which, at the end of a 3 years production process, promises a product of the value of £100, and in virtue of that promise is valued at £85, at the beginning of the process, does not remain stationary at the value of £85 till the moment when the production is completed, and then makes one bound up to its full present value of £100. Its value increases gradually as the time passes which divides the group from maturity, and the production process nears its completion. This circumstance is of great practical importance. Under the division of labor, scarcely any kind of production is carried through from beginning to end in the hands of one person. The separate stages of production become branches of production visibly independent, and conducted by separate undertakers. As the value thus increases by stages, a corresponding gain accrues as profit on capital, not only to the last undertaker, the one in whose hand the good becomes an actual present commodity, but to each of the undertakers, even to the one who has brought the product only a single step nearer maturity. A very common application arises from the fact that productive goods contribute various portions of their useful content to the making of various final products, which products arrive at maturity at various points of time. This is the case with all durable productive goods. A plow, for instance, which lasts 20 years, will contribute a 20th part of its life work and use to the ingathering of 20 different harvests, corresponding with this twofold property, that of means of production, and at the same time durable goods. Such goods, both in the formation and in the increase of their value, manifest a peculiar combination of phenomena. They unite the phenomena already known to us as characteristic of productive goods, with certain other special phenomena which accompany all durable goods, even those that are not devoted to productive purposes. We have, however, to deal particularly with this latter class of phenomena in a later chapter, and accordingly we must postpone the full explanation of this complication until then. Another complication arises from the fact that almost all productive instruments admit of various kinds of employment, and that these employments turn out their finished products at different points of time. The same fuel, for instance, may be employed in cooking a meal, or in keeping up a smithy fire, where the tools are made for boring a coal seam. In the first case only a few hours elapse till the finished product is turned out. In the latter it may be years, perhaps decades of years. This is true in particular of that most important productive good, unskilled labor. Various portions of it are always being employed simultaneously for productive purposes that come to maturity in the most varying periods of time. Some laborers must always get finishing work, which pays its wages almost on the moment. Others must be employed in the intermediate stages. Others again at the beginning of the total work of production, yet none of them has it written on his forehead whether his work is spent for the present or for the coming year, or for the remote future. At first sight it might appear that this complication must sensibly prejudice what we have laid down. as to the formation and the increase of value. Here is a good which will be used, perhaps as a present good, perhaps as a future good. Suppose that it is valued as a future good and therefore suffers a proportionate diminution of value. It seems as if this diminution were unjustifiable, if, after all, the good is used as a present good. But again, suppose it is valued without deduction as a present good and is, after all, employed as a future good. There is no room for increase of value, but obviously again, it is least of all possible to estimate different proportions of the same commodity at different values. But one portion as a present good without deduction, another as a future good with deduction. Of 10 loads of fuel of exactly the same kind and quality, one load is worth just as much as the other, as well to the householder as in the timber market. The apparent difficulty, however, entirely disappears if we apply the universal law of value carefully to the special circumstances of the case. The value of a good is determined by its marginal utility. This marginal utility is the least important use or employment that is provided for out of the available stock of goods. Suppose the stock contains 500 pieces of a kind which we shall call A. These goods possess the threefold capability of serving 1. Immediate as consumption goods, 2. As means of production in a 5 years process, or 3. As means of production in another branch of employment, in 10 years process. If they are used for immediate consumption, the capabilities are as follows. 100 pieces can be used with a useful result which we shall represent by the figure 6, another 100 with a result which we shall call 5, and a third 100 with a result which we shall call 4. But if the goods are employed in the 5 years production process, there will be a product, call it X, of which the first 100 can be remunerative at 9, the second at 8, and the third at 7 per piece. But these products will not be available before 5 years. In today's estimate, therefore, their value, like the value of all future goods, suffers a reduction. The amount of this reduction depends upon the amount of the agio, which emerges in favor of present goods as a resultant of the many intersecting subjective valuations in the market. If this agio, for instance, amount to 5%, the value of the products available in 5 years, as compared with present goods, suffers a reduction of a little over a fifth part. In the valuation of today, therefore, the prospect of obtaining of 5 years from one of the pieces employed as a means of production, a product which will then have a value of 9, is equal to a use realizable at the moment of 7.05. In the same way, the prospect of obtaining products of the value of 8 and 7 in 5 years is equal to present uses valued at 6.26 and 5.48 respectively. Similarly, if the goods are employed in a 10 years production process, if this gives the prospect of obtaining a product, call it Y, of which the first 100 can be remunerative at 16, the second 100 at 12, and the third at 8, these products, as not available before 10 years, suffer a reduction in today's estimate of something like 2/5, and are equal respectively to 9.82, 7.35, and 4.91. If we group together the present valuation of all these possibilities, we get the following table. The stock of 500 pieces admits of only 5 of the above possibilities being utilized. Naturally, those 5 will be taken which, in the valuation of today, the only standard of today's decisions, are the most remunerative. They are indicated in the above table by black figures, and we find them to be as follows. 100 pieces used in immediate consumption, 200 pieces employed in a 5 years process in making the goods X, 200 pieces employed in a 10 years process in making the goods Y. The least remunerative of the employments indicates the marginal utility, and with it the value of a single good A. That least remunerative use bears the value 6, and as it happens, belongs to the present. A good of class A, then, will be valued at 6. How does this stand now as regards the increment of value and the interest on capital? In the case of the 100 pieces which are employed in the service of the present, and fetch utility measured by 6, there is no room for an increment of value. But as they afford their marginal utility immediately, they do not require to bear any interest. The pieces invested in the 5 years process are worth 6, and in 5 years turn out a product which will be worth 8. Here there is room for an increase, at the usual rate of 5% for 5 years, in the ratio of, say 4 to 5, that is, from 6 to 7.5. Indeed, the room for increase and the gain in value is much greater. Beyond normal interest, which is secured when the product obtains the value of 7.5, there is a further profit of 0.5 per piece as premium for finding and utilizing the most favorable opportunities of employment in the present conjuncture, in other words as undertaker's profit. But usually this premium will not long continue. According to principles with which we are familiar, its existence attracts competition, and competition depresses price. How far will it depress it? Not lower than 7.5, for 7.5 obtainable in 5 years is equal in present valuation to 6 of present money, which is just the value of the productive good itself. Anything less than this price of 7.5, consequently, would not be thought a sufficient equivalent for the sacrifice of a good valued at 6, and in this unremunerative branch, production would be suspended until the limitation of supply again raised the price of the product to 7.5 of future money, as equal to 6 of present money. This being a state of things favorable to permanence, although the productive and therefore future good has received its value from 6 from a marginal utility, which belongs to the sphere of the present, and so suffers no deduction on account of its future nature, there remains quite sufficient room for a rise to the higher value of the future product. It is the same with the value and increase of value of those pieces invested in the 10 years process. At the moment, valued at the common marginal utility, they are worth 6. Their product, which becomes attainable in 10 years, will be worth 12. This leaves room for the normal increase of 5% per annum, from 6 to 10, and therefore, over 10 years, makes possible an increment of about 2/3 of the original value. Beyond this again, it leaves room, at least in the first instance, for the obtaining of an undertaker's profit. Should this profit disappear later on in consequence of competition, the future value of this product remains all the same at 10, and thus leaves room permanently for the normal increase of value, in which consists the customary interest. Thus we see that, although the pieces of class A were valued at the one figure, this one value guarantees to each of the possible uses exactly that room for increase, a value which the remoteness of its finished and final result demands. To the immediate use, where the utility of the good is at once realized, it guarantees nothing. To the 5 years process it allows an expansion of about 1/4. To the 10 years process an expansion of about 2/3 more than the original value. Perhaps there is even a greater expansion, in which case there remains a premium to the undertaker, but in any case it guarantees the expansion just named. And this nice harmony is easily explained from what has just been said. In estimating the present value of the many-sided good, its possible future employments had already been reduced to present value, whereby they experience a discount in exact ratio to their futurity. But only those future employments are found economically permissible, whose present reduced value is, at least, equal to the fixed value of the good, and whose effective future importance, therefore, is at least greater by the amount of the discount made pro rata temporis. Therefore, each of these future uses has assured it in advance a corresponding scope for recovery of its value. The lapse of time replaces the value which was taken from the estimate by way of discount, and this, in the near-hand uses which require to bear little interest, is small and is correspondingly great in the remote uses which must bear much interest. What has here been represented on a small scale by one slight instance obtains over the whole field of industrial employment. It is not a few hundreds but millions of productive units, days of labor, tons of coal, bars of iron, and so on, that are invested. They are invested not in 2 or 3 but in hundreds and thousands of separate employments, and each of these employments has a different period of production. All those means of production enjoy one homogeneous market price. That price is formed by the available stock being distributed out among the most remunerative employments and according to the degree of advantage which they bring. The most remunerative branches, in virtue of having the strongest purchasing power, are supplied first and with the greatest certainty, then the next remunerative branches, and so on down the scale, till the stock gives out. Some last portion of the stock, then, is taken for some last branch of employment, and the modest advantage that accrues determines the modest measure of what those last buyers can pay for the productive unit. But as the market price for all portions of the commodity is a homogeneous one, the value of the employment last applied determines the total market price of the means of production. But how, then, has the advantage and value of the individual kinds of employment been determined? By applying the same discount to employments for future advantage as has been described in our illustration, only that in rough practical life the discounting is made in a rough way that takes a great deal for granted. In practical life men generally find already in existence the things of which we have tried to explain, the elements, and are glad to accept them, without much reflection, as accomplished facts. In the same way do they take interest for granted, as an every-day fact, and without more ado, in all calculations relating to future employment, they add or deduct it. If an undertaker is considering whether or not he should lay out £100 on a productive instrument which will yield a result in 2 years' time, he simply calculates whether the future return will leave at least £100 over and above the 2 years' interest, and after deduction of the same. If he has thus deducted in advance from the future result an amount of interest proportioned to time and capital, it is a very natural thing that the future proceeds, when actually realized, should contain and yield that very amount of interest. The foregoing cases do not by any means exhaust the series of casuistical complications which obscure the working of our principle in the infinite variety of practical life. Happily, it is not necessary to exhaust them. Many are not of sufficient importance to justify us going into the tedious abstract demonstrations that would be needed to explain them, and for the rest, I venture to hope that in what has been already said, the careful reader will find enough to guide him among complications not expressly discussed without further assistance from me. There still remains for us, however, another important and by no means easy task. It is a word to follow the abstract into the actual and give it form and color. Hitherto by an argument which I hope is incontrovertible, but which I know to be highly abstract and general, I have tried to prove that it must be as I have maintained. I have now to show how it actually is so in the world of industry. So far I have deduced everything from the general proposition that productive goods are by nature future commodities. I have shown that in logical result the general reasons which explain how future commodities have a less value must also apply to productive goods, and thus explain how there is room for expansion into the full value of present goods, and for the appearance of a surplus value. I shall now attempt to show positively that all this is as I have said, and why it is. To this end I shall give a description of the markets, where in economic life means of production or productive instruments are exchanged against present goods, and shall try to show that in these markets the same motives to which we ascribe in general are the power of calling forth a difference of value between present and future goods, do really emerge, and emerge indeed in such combinations and with such strength, that as the result of the formation of price, there must always appear a disagio to the prejudice of the means of production. In doing so, I hope not only to bring forward an adequate proof of the correctness of my general deductions, but also to obtain a number of new and important lights on the subject generally.